Just imagine you've built a rock'em sock'em startup with all the core operational engines in place. Lead engine, check. Sales engine, check. Production and delivery engine, check. And you're ready for sustainable growth, but there's just one thing. The plans you originally developed to rapidly scale your business are untested, and there are clear signs that they may not work after all. Sure, your current operations are fine for the time being. However, now that you've drawn attention of your largest competitor and investors are pouring money into new innovations in your space, you're only 6 to 12 months away from a significant struggle that you're not sure whether you'll win. So what do you do now? In this episode, we're going to discuss the steps you will take to validate your scale hypothesis to lower your costs associated with lead generation, customer acquisition, production and delivery, and we'll cover a whole lot more. I'm Stephen White, and this is Building Lean. Hey there, awesome founders. Welcome back once again to Building Lean, our series of workshops that cover the steps and activities your startup must take to build key business functions to sustainably generate revenues. If you're interested in growing your startup by building lean, please subscribe to our YouTube channel and click that notification bell nearby so you can receive the latest insights that will help you avoid mistakes that cost you time and money. Now, let's get to why you're actually here. This episode wraps up our dive into the activities you need to complete in order to successfully achieve the second startup phase of repeatable sales and delivery. Once again, as a quick refresher, repeatable sales and delivery means the ability to repeatably sell, produce, and deliver your product while satisfying a growing number of customers as you solve the compelling problem that they similarly experience. In other words, this phase is about automating your key business activities in preparation for scaled growth, all while not losing focus on serving your customers' needs. Without validating that you can repeatably gain customer traction and delight your customer with your product or service, you'll be unprepared to sustainably grow your business, which is the third startup phase. Sure, you may try to scale your startup without having this proof, but like a rocket without all systems working, you're likely to crash and burn without achieving your goal. So during our last episode, I covered the process of building a production and delivery engine that can regularly produce your product or service as well as deliver it to and delight your customer. During this episode, we're focused on the process of validating the scale hypotheses, which will help you scale leads, sales, production, and delivery. When you originally documented your possible scale strategies during the last milestone of market validation, your goal was to simply determine the feasibility by performing a basic analysis for each one. At that point, it wasn't time to validate whether your scale hypotheses would work as you hadn't built your automated lead engine, sales engine, and production and delivery engine. But now that's behind you, and you're ready to focus on the final preparation milestone before moving on to the next big phase of your startup, which is sustainable growth. And this means that you'll actually test the strategies that you hypothesize during market validation. Without testing and validating those strategies, you'll enter the sustainable growth phase with untested assumptions that can stall your progress and delay your ability to sustainably grow your business. So it goes without saying that this is an essential step in building a thriving, sustainable business. And even more importantly, this routine of developing and validating a new scale hypotheses at each growth milestone will become a key activity, a key cultural aspect within your operation to ensure you can sustain growth for each new product you add to your company's portfolio. Now, before I cover how you'll scale, let's first discuss when you'll know you're ready to scale. And this is a really important point. You should never attempt to scale until you have traction for your product. So what does that mean? It means that you have validated customer demand and your product delivers on the value promised during the sales cycle, as well as your customer recognizes the value your product provides by adopting your solution. Only then you are ready to scale operations. You must remember that this virtuous innovation cycle for every new feature and product line will be part of what you introduce going forward. So is that clear? Awesome. So now, let's look at the strategies you'll use to grow your startup into a lasting and durable business. For nearly every business, there are 4 hypergrowth strategies. In almost all cases, there's a logical order that we recommend that you follow. While there are exceptions, we'll save discussions about that for a separate episode. So before I cover each strategy in the order in which you should implement them, I want you to remind you that you won't implement these strategies now, as execution will actually occur during the third startup phase, which it happens just after this milestone. I'm only introducing these here to provide you context regarding why you need to validate your scale hypotheses as part of completing the repeatable sales and delivery phase, that second startup development phase, instead of prematurely moving on. So hypergrowth strategy number 1 is where you first grow the market share of your startup's initial target market. Then you grow the percentage wallet share your startup earns from each customer within that market segment, which is part of actually hypergrowth strategy number 2. So let me break down what that exactly means. Here, your first goal is to make sure you work out how to grow the percentage that you capture within your target market share by constantly improving your product. For those who are not visual learners, this is not a case of your startup trying to grow the size of the pie. Instead, it's actually about taking a larger slice of that pie and taking as you take away customers from your competitors. So to do this, the key activity you need to focus on is that of product improvement and redesign, as you become more and more driven by increasing the value your product or service delivers, such that your solution becomes heavily favored by your customers, which crowds out competitors who are unable to match your value. And you'll do this until you have saturated your initial target market. Now that your startup is in a dominant market position for that initial target customer, you don't want to lose focus on the opportunity in front of you by rushing to develop a new market segment, which is why hypergrowth strategy 2 comes into place. And this is where you determine your upsell opportunities to increase the wallet share you can gain from each customer within this same market, within this same segment that you just saturated during hypergrowth strategy number 1. For a great example of this growth strategy, look no further than Apple in its methodical development of their market-leading iPhone over the past dozen plus years. So as a quick refresher, Apple's initial target market for the iPhone was business users who needed fast access to the web, email, and phone in one device when those busy professionals were away from their desk. Now, this may have seemed like a small target customer initially, but by being a business user, these customers were hungry for a reliable solution. So by partnering with AT&T as its exclusive network provider, Apple saturated this market with the iPhone 3 and 4. By the time Apple released the iPhone 4S, it introduced its iCloud services, enabling to gain a larger share of each customer's wallet by selling cloud backup subscriptions, while also developing further upsell opportunities for the iPhone itself by offering more device storage options. Now, hypergrowth strategy number 3 is where your startup grows its total addressable market, or TAM, by targeting new market segments. Once again, to use a visual metaphor, after taking a larger and larger percentage of your initial pie, it's time for you to start focusing on the next pie. So let's look back at our Apple example to see how this happens. Well, after Apple saturated its AT&T customer base 2 years ahead of schedule, Apple focused on expanding its total addressable market by adding additional carriers. While Apple originally signed a 5-year exclusivity agreement with AT&T, they renegotiated the terms so as to make the iPhone 4 available to Verizon customers 7 months after the initial launch of that device with AT&T. So with a new target customer segment acquired, Apple then repeated hypergrowth strategies number 1 and hypergrowth strategy number 2 with its Verizon customer base. However, the effort required to increase market share with Verizon customers was minimal, as Apple had already figured out how to penetrate a larger customer base with AT&T customers by offering more storage options and subscription services. And since Apple's App Store was already well established, Apple focused on recruiting top developers who were publishing paid apps, which enabled Apple to increase its wallet share for both target customer segments. Hypergrowth strategy number 4 is where your startup is focused on introducing new product lines that solve additional compelling problems that your existing customers experience. Now, this approach leverages the gains you've made with your existing customer base and the supporting infrastructure you've developed related to lead generation, sales conversion, product production, and value delivery. For Apple, it did this by introducing the Apple Watch in 2014 as a health and fitness tracking device that was initially complementary to, but not independent of, the iPhone. The Apple Watch was released a full 7 years after initial launch of the original iPhone, as Apple observed a market opportunity with its customers who were using fitness apps to track their activity but were dissatisfied carrying a bulky phone with them when they went out for a run or worked out. While other smartphone competitors had previously released smartwatches, those devices were focused on an abstract general use instead of targeting a specific customer need. Effectively, at its release, the Apple Watch competed directly against Fitbit instead of Samsung, LG, or Google. So now that you understand the 4 hypergrowth strategies, let's return to what you need to do to successfully complete this milestone. You're only going to focus on testing and validating your scale hypotheses related to hypergrowth strategy number 1 and hypergrowth strategy number 2. You'll reserve any focus on hypergrowth strategies number 3 and 4 for the next startup phase of sustainable growth, as you'll be unable to implement those without first successfully executing hypergrowth strategy number 1 and 2. They compound on each other. So before jumping into the process that you'll use to validate your scale hypotheses, we like to consider alternatives to achieving each of the milestones that we've identified. And for that matter, often Shafiq and I are asked by founders who are anxious to scale their startup idea. Simply, they ask us, guys, why do I need to worry about validating how I'll scale now? I just need to do it to see whether it works or not. Plus, guys, getting funded will solve any problems that come up. So once again, as happens, this question comes from a valid perspective. I mean, you think about it. Why waste time validating a plan when you can just skip ahead to executing the plan, especially if you're funded? Well, one thing that we've all learned by watching some recent spectacular startup failures is that money does not always help you stay lean and focused on the primary goal of speeding up value delivery to your customers as a key differentiator. And it definitely doesn't help you achieve your secondary goal of reducing production and delivery costs, which helps your profitability. Matter of fact, many founders believe that money will solve their scaling challenges. And this is in part due to founders feeling like money will relieve their own stress, while not recognizing how money may change the efficiency in which they're operating. In fact, believing that being funded will provide the flexibility to fix any scale mistakes will often lead to sloppy execution and open the door to form more nimble, lean competitors who will learn from your mistakes and zoom past your bloated startup. And we can see what happens to startups that make this mistake scaling prematurely without a validated scale strategy in 2 well-known examples. Beginning with Wework, the global co-working behemoth that imploded in the months leading up to its scheduled IPO. Wework was founded in 2010 by Adam Newman and Miguel McKelvey after they had sold their original Brooklyn-based co-working space, Green Desk. Learning from its original concept, Wework was launched by acquiring favorable lease terms at prime commercial real estate locations throughout New York City, as it benefited from substantial vacancies resulting from the 2008 financial crisis, along with a growing number of talented professionals who were newly laid off in freelancing or starting their own businesses. As the fastest growing lessee of space in New York City, Wework's model of providing affordable, flexible, on-demand office space was proving to be a hit with customers and caught the attention of investors and media alike. The Wework model was simple when you think about it. Identify an underperforming commercial property in a strategic location, sign a long-term rental agreement for a substantial block of space, create a modern community feel to the space with attentive services, and then rent fractional access to the office space. The community feel, services, and hosted events provide the stickiness to stand out when compared to other traditional short-term hoteling options from competitors such as Regus. Wework seemed to be well on its way to market domination as it made acquisitions geared to support more foot traffic into and higher use of its spaces. That was until Wework filed its S1 in preparation for going public just after raising one last private equity round, with valuing Wework at $47 billion. In this legal filing with the SEC, it became evident that Wework's growth at all costs came at quite the cost after all. Wework's profitability was contingent on an arbitrage and the lower price per square foot Wework paid through its long-term leases against the higher price paid by Wework's customers through short-term co-working rentals. Plus, by hosting regular community events and spaces, WeWork's customer acquisition costs were expected to decline year over year as local organizations brought WeWork qualified leads who would experience the space and become more likely to convert into a paying customer. Instead, WeWork was losing nearly $5,200 per customer who inhabited its office space each year. Or, by another measure, WeWork was losing $219,000 each hour of each day. Effectively, WeWork had prematurely scaled without having validated its ability to keep each location profitable by proving out that its office timeshare model worked. Now, want to know where WeWork went wrong when scaling? I'll tell you in a moment when we cover how to perform the fatal flaw analysis for this milestone. But first, we have one more startup scale failure to cover with Theranos, the health tech startup with a breakthrough innovation that enabled rapid blood testing with a small amount of blood through the use of its proprietary automated devices. Now, before I dive into this example, I do really want to acknowledge two things up front. Number one, like WeWork with Adam Newman, Theranos had a founder CEO who was the face of the startup in Elizabeth Holmes. And like WeWork, there is quite a bit of controversy over whether the founder committed fraud along the way in growing the business. However, I want to be upfront. I'm not going to explore any issues around the CEO right now. Instead, I'm going to focus on the business and the decisions made in its approach to scaling, because that's what's relevant here. Number two, Theranos was not a character in Marvel's Avengers series. That was Thanos. While Elizabeth Holmes may wish she can change history with a snap, that's not what this story is about. Having launched Theranos in 2003 after dropping out of Stanford, Ms. Holmes pursued her passion for democratizing healthcare by reducing the cost and time for blood-based testing. Over the ensuing 10 years, Theranos worked in stealth mode without press releases or a company website, which seems pretty smart. By the time that Theranos announced in 2013 its first partnership with Walgreens to launch in-store blood tests, it had raised more than $400 million with a $9 billion valuation, along with a board comprising a who's who list of advisors. However, a significant problem existed in that its technology was not ready for scale, as its Edison devices were failing to achieve its blood testing speed, accuracy, and reliability claims. Pretty significant. So instead of fixing its technology or recognizing its inability to deliver on its promises, the Theranos management team chose to plow ahead by hiding its data, avoiding peer review of its claims, and misleading key stakeholders, all of which culminated in Theranos failing in its executives facing legal jeopardy. So having said all that, you may be wondering what lesson could possibly be learned from Theranos with regards to proving out a scaling plan. Well, in this case, I won't leave you hanging on the answer because it's rather straightforward. Theranos wasn't ready to scale due to its flaws in its product, as well as it was unable to deliver on its original promise. Even though it had proven its scale hypothesis for lead generation and sales conversion, it was not ready to validate its production and delivery scale hypothesis due to flaws in its product design. Furthermore, the Theranos management team should have been communicating to its key stakeholders, especially its board of directors, what its plans were for its product design issues and how this raised the risk of its established agreements with Walgreens as well as Safeway. So this is a cautionary note to founders. It's better to take your lumps early in an attempt to overcome your fatal flaws rather than to fake it and end up facing decades of litigation. So before I discuss the activities you need to take in order to validate your scale hypotheses, let's look at the goals you'll use to measure your progress. When it comes to validating your startup's scale hypotheses, you need to have a plan in place to measure whether you're on track with hitting your goal. To measure your progress, we use a technique called OKR, which stands for Objective and Key Results, and it's a framework for setting and measuring goals, as well as the results of the activities to achieve them. For this fourth milestone of scale hypothesis validated, we've designed a 30-day OKR that keeps you focused on completing the activities necessary to finish this milestone within 1 month. The key results here correspond directly with your progress on the underlying work plan. So let's review what your execution cycle should be. Since we've already done all the hard work by building a project guide, I'll use this as a reference point for this episode. Now, the key aspect is as you begin each activity, you need to plan your work so it can be completed in manageable, bite-sized chunks. This prevents the feeling of being overwhelmed in the work ahead or discouraged when you encounter a small setback. Once you've made your activity plan using the framework, tools, and process guides that I'm about to cover, you'll work on each activity in an orderly manner, which will keep you focused and on target. And after completing all the activities for a given milestone, you need to schedule time to review your results with an advisor. Your advisor can help you with a fresh pair of eyes to quickly analyze whether you have correctly validated your scale hypothesis or not. In this last step of your execution cycle, you need to evaluate whether your idea suffers from a fatal flaw related to your scale assumption. If you have advisors who are well-versed in lean methodologies, then they should be able to help you perform this analysis. And if not, you can contact myself or Shafiq to help with this. By the way, it may seem redundant to perform a fatal flaw analysis during the second startup phase related to your scale assumption when you already performed this during market validation. But in fact, this fatal flaw analysis is focused on the validation aspect of your scale assumption, which is something you weren't concerned with before as you performed a simple assessment of the feasibility of your scale assumptions or scale options back then. Okay, now that you understand how to proceed using a project guide, let's look quickly at the detailed activities for repeatable sales and deliveries, fourth milestone, scale hypothesis validated. Oh, I almost forgot one thing. Once you achieve the last repeatable sales and delivery milestone, you'll be ready to move to the third startup development phase of sustainable growth because you'll be confident that you have a strategy that can help your business thrive. To successfully achieve the scale hypothesis validated milestone, you'll complete the following 5 activities. So let's look at each of these activities in detail now. You'll begin with activity number 1 by testing each additional channel you identify in the scale hypothesis identified milestone during market validation. By testing each channel now, you're trying to measure the effectiveness of that channel and helping you reach a larger share of your initial target market represented by the early majority customers. Understanding these costs will help you validate if you can quickly scale your leads per month while reducing your per qualified lead costs. If your costs are significantly greater than your initial hypothesis developed during the market validation phase, then you need to develop and test a new channel scaling hypothesis until you have a minimum of 2 channels you can effectively use that fit within your cost model for cost per qualified lead. Now, while the OKR for scaling your lead engine is 3 channels, a minimum of 2 channels will be tolerable as you continue to develop additional channel options while scaling. Now, why do we want at least 2 channels though? Simply enough, to manage the risk of your primary channel becoming ineffective. Unless you own your own channel, you must develop effective alternatives in case your primary channel becomes saturated with competitors. In which case, you'll encounter rising customer acquisition costs that will hamper your growth. So as a reminder, we previously covered the example of Tutorspree, which failed to manage its risk as it was only able to develop a single channel strategy by relying on search engine optimization. When Google's search algorithm changed though, Tutorspree's traffic plummeted overnight by 80% with no cost-effective backup channel ready to backfill the loss in qualified leads. So now you know. Be sure to test and validate your alternate channels before scaling, as it'll become too late to act should you need it, much less when you're ready to sustainably grow. When it comes to validating how you'll scale your sales engine, you'll return to the alternatives related to how you'll convert qualified leads into sales. Now keep in mind, sales models are often tied to the market segments being served due to their effectiveness. So in activity number 2, you will test different sales models to see which one will help your sales grow fast while lowering your customer acquisition costs. Again, the idea is to find multiple viable alternatives that when combined can effectively help your startup grow fast and stay ahead of your competitors. Now, if your growth strategy ends up targeting different market segments which require you to sell differently than how your initial sales engine is built, you will then need to validate each new selling method to ensure your customer acquisition costs are consistent with your budget. So let's look at an example of this so I can explain what I actually mean here. Back in the 1990s, Microsoft was growing quite rapidly by selling directly to corporations. However, when Microsoft began selling to small businesses, it found that the same direct model was not cost effective. To overcome this scale challenge, Microsoft started selling its software through retail channels. However, this created a new problem in that customer returns and support costs through this channel were high. As Microsoft realized that to effectively serve the small business segment, it had to pivot from its initial retail channel strategy, which was the impetus for creating its acclaimed partner network. So What can you learn from the steps that Microsoft took back in the 1990s? Well, not all customer segments can be served by a single sales model. Matter of fact, in Microsoft's case, what worked for very large customers failed with very small customers. Thus, your selling model may have to change in order to serve each customer type along the way of your growth. During activity number 3, you're testing each production and delivery strategy to determine if your initial scale hypotheses are correct. Now, what do you do if one of your hypotheses requires you to spend millions of dollars to build a factory? Well, obviously you cannot directly test that hypothesis. However, you can validate the capital budget and building timeframe you have estimated by getting firm quotes from multiple vendors that will help you build the factory, as well as procure and install the equipment necessary to operate the factory, including understanding the market labor rates. In all cases, whether you're going to produce the goods yourself or have an outsourcing partner, you must test each one by getting real quotes and determine if the lead times and cost estimates are within 10% of your estimate. More importantly, you need to determine the improvements you need both in the product design as well as your production plan that will consistently help you speed up the production process while driving down the per unit production cost. This level of validation is necessary to know that your solution's gross margins will grow as you sell and produce more, rather than being caught off guard by an unsustainable product feature that creates new step costs that an alternative production delivery scale plan would avoid. In activity number 4, you'll test and validate your business's key activities that are necessary to run operations and improve existing products as well as create new products. Depending on how you deliver your solution as well as the customers you serve, your operations key activities will focus on engaging your customers, ensuring that your product or service continues to solve their compelling problem, and validating that your customers are delighted by your solution. Similar to the production and delivery hypothesis, you may not be able to directly test your scale hypothesis for growing your key activities. So for example, at your current stage, each member of your team is likely wearing multiple hats and are not only producing, but also helping to support your product. But as you grow, your support team will need to be separated out and focus on ensuring that they are not only helping deliver the product, but also that it's getting adopted. And when your startup grows really large, you'll further separate your delivery team from your support team altogether. Which means that understanding the number of support incidents per 100 units of product adopted is an important metric for your team to measure and monitor at this stage. This validated number can be the basis for developing a support model that helps you determine the number of people your business will need to perform the support function as you scale. So another important task you need to accomplish during this activity is to identify the key metrics for each product that will help you focus your scale efforts using the 4 hypergrowth strategies we introduced at the beginning of this episode. Recall how Apple introduced additional storage options to grow its total addressable market. Remember that? Well, Apple didn't stop there, as it adopted larger screen sizes, which further expanded its TAM. And of course, let's not forget that Apple has introduced its own subscription services, such as the iCloud, Apple Music, Apple TV, Apple Arcade, Apple News, and Apple Fitness. And that was all done to grow the wallet share within its existing customer base. So that means in this activity, you're going to develop KPIs around improvements to your product or service, as well as around production process improvements that will guide your R&D efforts. As another example of our favorite startup, Tesla, very early on, Tesla determined that its battery cost was a key metric that it needed to reduce in order to increase its total addressable market. So why did it do that? 2 reasons actually. Number 1, batteries are the single most expensive component in an electric vehicle. And number 2, without the ability to reduce the cost of each car, Tesla would not reach downstream car buyers who needed a more affordable car. For each of these activities, I want you to remember one thing. You're not actually implementing your scale plan during this milestone. Instead, you're simply testing and validating your scale assumptions and performing a basic analysis to ensure your financial model is still intact so you can produce the profits you need to build a sustainable business. And that's why there's only a 30-day time frame to achieve this milestone. Still, all of this may seem like a lot to prove out in 30 days, but keep in mind, by the time you're validating your scale hypotheses, your team may have grown to 10 to 15 people, which enables you to work on many of these validation activities in parallel. So before moving to the next startup development phase of sustainable growth, you'll first analyze the results from your activities for this milestone. To assess your progress to achieve this milestone success criteria, you'll answer the following questions. Is your lead scaling plan tested and validated? Is your sales scaling plan tested and validated? Is your production and delivery scaling plan tested and validated? And finally, are your key activities scaling plan and tested and validated? Now, if you answered yes to each of these 4 questions, then you'll have completed the second startup development phase of repeatable sales and delivery, and you can be confident that you have a business with the potential to sustainably grow. Since testing requires you to measure the results against original estimates, once again, it'll take you about 30 days to complete this last milestone. One other thing, by achieving repeatable sales and delivery, you'll be ready to raise Series A funding necessary to scale your business. Now, that's great. However, you need to know what to do if you answer no to any of those preceding questions. The last fatal flaw that you need to overcome is when your business is just too difficult to grow, which means you must perform your fatal flaw analysis. Now, this is a very real problem that founders often overlook today due to the proliferation of options to automate your business functions, along with reduced logistics costs if you want to outsource production of a physical product. While those advancements are ones that we all benefit from, it also reduces competitive barriers that previously protected your businesses. An example of how a business can be too difficult to grow can be witnessed by more and more founders incorporating personalized concierge services into their solutions. Managing bespoke experiences being delivered by thousands or millions of providers, like in the case of Uber, Airbnb, Fiverr, or Instacart, can create complexity that makes a successful startup struggle to have a breakout. In some cases, startups plateau due to their success performing the key activities that were needed to get started, and now those same activities are not easily translatable when the company scales to reach new markets and offer new solutions. When this fatal flaw actually appears, it's due to one of 5 causes. So let's begin by looking at each one in order. The first cause can be tested if you're unable to validate any of your hypothesized methods for reducing your cost of acquiring new customer leads. The cause of which is due to channel costs not decreasing with volume, and you're unable to develop and test a working hypothesis to determine how you'll make this happen. When this occurs, your corrective actions are, you have a couple of them. Number 1, you can identify methods for developing your own channel that lower your cost per lead as you scale your customer lead volume. Number 2, you may need to change your target by focusing on the next customer segment that you had previously documented. By the way, this will enable you to see if that segment has better potential for reducing costs with volume. Now, before moving to the next test condition and cause, I want to mix things up a bit once again here and dive directly into an example of why this test condition matters. So, while the examples that I covered during the market validation phase, and particularly the scaling milestone during market validation, are really related to this fatal flaw, and they still apply during the repeatable sales and delivery phase, let's instead frame these issues in relation to one of the case studies that I just discussed. In this case, Wework is an excellent example of a company that didn't determine a cost-effective method for scaling its channel, especially related to marketing to startup founders. While Wework attempted a number of options to attract small businesses, including the acquisition of the Flatiron Coding School and starting its own in-house incubator, none of these actually reduced its customer acquisition costs to acceptable levels. The lesson learned is that Wework should have returned its focus to the less glamorous but better proven channel of signing up mid-size and enterprise class customers. This customer segment had a validated need for flexible office space options in multiple cities and would have been less likely to experience churn. Plus, Wework had validated that channel was effective with the agreement placed where it ended up placing many of Microsoft's sales staff at Wework locations around the country. The second cause for this fatal flaw has to do with the cost of acquiring a new customer. Now, as I previously mentioned, your CAC, or customer acquisition cost, is the money you'll spend to convert your leads into sales. Once you have a lead, you have to take extra actions to convert that lead into a closed sale. And if you're unable to validate any of your hypotheses regarding how you'll reduce these costs with volume, then you will suffer from this fatal flaw. Now, think of this as a situation where it costs you $1.50 to close each customer sale and you only generate $1 revenue from each sale. You're literally bleeding out because you're losing money on each sale. And founders fool themselves into accepting this risk up front by believing that more volume will drive down those costs, especially if their startup is being valued based on customer volume and not profitability. The reality when this occurs is that you're in trouble and you need to take one of the following corrective actions. Number one, you should explore pivoting to an alternative business model that can reduce your selling costs, such as when a B2B startup starts selling through a self-serve model instead of face-to-face sales. Or number two, you may consider sales channel partners as an option, as you can share sales costs in pursuing complementary customers. So once again, we can return to Wework for this example to see what didn't work. So clearly, Wework's sales engine did not scale, as it was losing nearly, once again, $5,200 per customer who inhabited its office space each year. While this partially reflects that Wework didn't properly validate that its pricing model would generate a sustainable profit, it also reflects that by ignoring direct sales to enterprise customers for online sales to startups, Wework had erred in building the wrong sales model. The lesson learned for Wework is that it should have saturated the enterprise market segment prior to entering the unprofitable startup and small business market that resulted in higher customer churn rates. The third cause for this fatal flaw deals with the production costs. If your product unit costs are not able to decrease as you build production volume, you'll be unable to scale your business. If you're getting real outsourced production quotes, or in the case of wanting to scale by producing internally, you're getting the capital costs from vendors who will build your production facility, and these are not in line with your initial estimates, then your product unit costs will not be able to decrease as you build product production volume, which means you'll be unable to scale your business. By the way, this is also true for software. Instead of thinking about a physical production facility, you need to consider how much it'll cost your team to publish a new version of your software, as well as how long that takes. And in the software business, you need to publish new updates approximately every 2 weeks, or you'll end up falling behind your competitors. The costs associated with continuous product development and improvement cannot be ignored. You must establish the labor and equipment costs you're incurring with each new release. While this seems unlikely to occur, if you have highly manual or high-touch processes built into your production to deliver a custom solution, you'll easily encounter a struggle where your profit margins remain flat as you miss the benefits of volume-related cost reductions. In this case, your customers may love the custom touches, but will become disappointed in your ability to sustain them. Fortunately, you have a couple of options for your corrective actions. Number one, you may want to redesign your solution to better benefit from automation options during production. Number two, you could identify and qualify an outsourced product manufacturing partner where you'll benefit from labor cost arbitrage by locating your production in a lower cost geography. An underappreciated risk that comes with outsourcing, though, is that you need to be confident that delays due to logistics or differences in time zones won't negatively impact your ability to fulfill customer demand. So let's see what happens when a startup's production plan doesn't actually scale. So by the time Alta Motors announced it was shutting down production in 2018, it had received multiple awards for its all-electric bike, resulting in a robust sales channel, which meant that its shutdown was a shock to its 70-member dealer network. However, in Alta's case, it was unable to drive down its production costs, which made it unsustainable. It attempted even to partner with market leader Harley-Davidson in hope of opening up a new market for the venerable motorcycle manufacturer. So while Alta took the appropriate corrective action, it was an all or nothing point. And when negotiations with Harley broke down, Alta was left with nowhere to turn. The lesson learned for Alta was that it should have anticipated its production cost challenges and worked earlier to line up additional outsourced production assistance sooner. Another aspect of determining your scale feasibility related to your solution is connected to actual delivery of your product or service. As you've seen with each test condition related to the fifth fatal flaw, you're testing whether your product delivery costs will decrease with additional volume. When these costs don't scale due to the costly nature to deliver each unit, it's likely due to owning the logistics process end-to-end up front. During market validation, you want to be high touch with your customers, including personally delivering your service. For example, Travis Kalanick and his co-founders were the first drivers for Uber. Matter of fact, in those first days, when you used the original Uber cab service in San Francisco, it was highly likely that Uber's management team picked you up in their own car. However, that obviously wouldn't be sustainable, which is why they've developed a business model predicated on leveraging excess capacity from individuals who wanted to pick up a side hustle. When you encounter this issue, you have a couple of corrective actions. Number one, you can develop your own logistics marketplace for those who would like to deliver your product or service as a certified contractor. Now keep in mind, this is a complex process that can take away your focus from your primary solution offering, which means that the second corrective action may work best for most founders. Speaking of which, that second corrective action is to identify and qualify an existing logistics partner that will handle your solution delivery. This step is best when the last mile of cost delivery is the hardest to reduce. Many retailers turn to the ease of Amazon's fulfillment services for this very reason, because Amazon's scale provides an immediate delivery cost reduction when compared to most independent small businesses. So now let's look at an example of a company that didn't work out its product delivery issues prior to scaling. While it seems like home grocery delivery is a new concept, Webvan was actually a pioneer during the dot-com days of the late 90s. But instead of leveraging the gig economy with shoppers who would pick and deliver groceries from nearby stores, Webvan attempted to build out its own grocery business from scratch. This means that as Webvan aggressively expanded into 26 cities near simultaneously, it also built out its own warehouses and fulfillment infrastructure from scratch, including the purchase of a fleet of Webvans to fulfill a delivery promise of 30 minutes or less after a customer placed an order. Wow. Well, needless to say, these delivery infrastructure costs required substantial upfront capital. While Webvan's sales were robust, it lost nearly $800 million due to increasing delivery costs with little near-term opportunity for scale. The lesson learned here is one already learned by many modern grocery delivery startups, and that's infrastructure costs could be distributed across a fleet of gig economy workers rather than bearing the upfront delivery infrastructure costs that slows the ability to scale. Now, the last test condition you'll evaluate is whether you can reduce the cost of key activities when determining scale feasibility. Since I've spent quite a bit of time discussing milestone number 4, I want to remind you one thing that should have come through during the case studies. This fatal flaw analysis is occurring during repeatable sales and delivery, obviously, which means you're in a short cycle of validating your scale hypotheses from when you eventually begin to scale during the third startup development phase of sustainable growth, which is right around the corner. You're not taking actions to scale itself. I just want to emphasize that it's really important, but you need to be prepared, which is what these other companies have failed to do, which is why we're highlighting them. Okay, now returning to reducing your key activities costs, you need to understand what key activities are. Key activities for a thriving business include new product development, support, HR, finance, and many other operational activities depending on the type of product you have. A good way to think about key activities are those things that are essential to sustain and grow your business. The 2 corrective actions you can take if you haven't been able to identify how you'll reduce these costs would be: number 1, you can identify and qualify a partner to outsource non-scalable activities that are non-core to your business. An example of this could be procurement or HR and payroll. Number 2, you may want to determine the feasibility to spin off a new venture to perform a key activity when the market does not have a strong player that can meet your outsourcing business needs. Once again, Amazon is a perfect example of this. No one else was capable of providing the dynamic cloud computing capabilities Amazon needed to maintain its own e-commerce site. Once Amazon built it for its own needs and recognized how others needed it too, Amazon began to offer Amazon Web Services, or AWS, to other businesses, which enabled Amazon to grow its capacity further while reducing its key activity costs. So let's look at one last example of a company that wasn't as savvy as Amazon and failed to overcome fatal flaw number 5. PoppyCare launched in 2015 as a childcare marketplace for working families. It was able to grow quickly due to its intense focus on solving the needs in the nearby Seattle communities. When a family searched for a care provider, Poppy's team could quickly identify, vet, and match the appropriate caregiver. However, as Poppy scaled, it hadn't built the scalable infrastructure to provide customer support for its online booking service, due in part to the thin margins Poppy was earning from each transaction. So instead of partnering with an outsourced call center, Poppy pivoted to other business models in the hope of retaining its personal mom and pop touch, because that was an essential part of the founders wanted to retain the culture. Unfortunately, each pivot left Poppy's initial target market dissatisfied, including the care providers Poppy recruited. The lesson learned is that Poppy should have recognized the urgency for scaling out support activities and taken action rather than pivoting prematurely and overlooking its customers' actual needs. Now, if you're looking to change how you grow your startup by building lean and you find these workshops helpful, please subscribe to this YouTube channel and click the notification button, as well as give us a like or drop a positive comment. Also, if you know of other founders or product managers who could benefit from our workshops, please share this video with them so they too can build their startups lean and avoid mistakes that cost time and money. Building Lean is brought to you by the Lean Mastery Incubator. Unlike other incubators or accelerators that rush you to pitch to investors whether you're ready or not, Lean Mastery guides you in building key business functions that turn up revenues fast, which puts you in the best position to successfully raise money and outrun your competition. Learn more about how you can become a Lean Mastery Incubator member at leanmastery.co. Thank you all for watching, and remember, don't let anyone knock you off from achieving your dreams, as we believe you can do it, and we're here with you every step along the way.